This is how Europe might have looked if the Soviet Union had defended Czechoslovakia from German aggression in 1938. Historically, Czechoslovakia was known for its division in the same year it ceded the Sudetenland to Germany at the Munich Conference. I would like to raise the question of what would have happened if the Soviet Union had decided to help seemingly lonely Czechoslovakia against the German aggressor. This was possible because there were good relations between the two countries, evidenced by the signing of the Czechoslovak-Soviet Mutual Assistance Treaty on May 16, 1935. According to rumors, Stalin promised to defend Czechoslovakia in case of an attack by Germany or Poland, but only if France decided to help first. You will soon learn how the Soviet Union's support for Czechoslovakia could have affected the morale of German troops and how it would have reflected on events in Europe. Let's look at the map. One could argue that the Soviet support for Czechoslovakia wouldn't make much difference. The reason is that these two countries do not share a common border, and even if Germany hypothetically decided to invade Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union could not directly assist its ally. During the Sudeten crisis, the Soviet Union expressed interest in supporting Czechoslovakia and considered sending equipment through Poland. However, the Poles were not thrilled with this idea and declared that they would shoot down all Soviet planes flying over their territory. Thus, the Soviet Union was effectively blocked from sending aid to Czechoslovakia. It is necessary to mention the Munich Conference, where France, Great Britain, Germany, and Italy decided that Czechoslovakia should yield the Sudetenland in exchange for eternal peace. In fact, the country ceased to exist the following year. In this alternative historical scenario, the same conference would have taken place, but I propose that Edward Benish did not surrender the most fortified areas to Germany. He would realize that if Czechoslovakia conceded the Sudetenland, nothing would stop Germany from seizing the rest of the country, which actually happened. I just assumed that Czechoslovakia could have rejected the results of the Munich Conference. Therefore, Germany would likely invade Czechoslovakia. As I mentioned, the Soviet Union had good relations with this country but stated that it would enter the war against Germany or Poland only if France did so first. With Czechoslovakia's rejection of the French peace plan, the French and British are unlikely to join this conflict. However, if the Poles decide to occupy western Ukraine in the event of a war between Germany and Czechoslovakia, this would give the Red Army a reason to attack Poland under the pretext of defending Czechoslovakia. I remind you that historically this is what happened, but the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in 1938. It did so a year later. What will happen if the Poles decide to take advantage of the Czechoslovak army's occupation and then occupy the territory of Zlin and Slovakia? The fact that the Polish government does not want to risk war with the Red Army under any circumstances does not mean that the disputed territory will not be occupied. Perhaps Poland still believes that the Red Army will not respond seriously to this attack on Czechoslovak sovereignty. In this alternative reality, where Czechoslovakia rejected the Munich Agreement, the Germans paved the way for war, fully aware that France and Britain will not intervene. I want to emphasize again the reason why the Allies will not join the conflict. They agreed to maintain peace in Europe, and Czechoslovakia had to cede part of its territory. Now that the Czechoslovak government has refused, the Allies can say they did everything possible. But it is Czechoslovakia that is to blame for the start of the war, not them. As a result, I believe Czechoslovakia can be blamed for the start of the war, at least by France and Britain. This is how the German invasion of the country will unfold. Germany will advance slowly but surely, aiming to maximize chaos and draw Poland to its side. This is because the Poles effectively took advantage of Czechoslovakia by annexing Zlin, which, I remind you, really happened in history. The Germans will have no trouble creating an incident to pull Poland into the war, but not as an ally. Despite their allied relations, Poland and Germany will not be allies. They will have a common enemy. To this end, several SS members will disguise themselves in Czechoslovak uniforms and sabotage a paramilitary train in the Polish part of Zlin, likely provoking the Polish army under General Warszynski to retaliate against Czechoslovakia. This act was to take place on October 4th, that is, on the fourth day of the war. At this time, due to bad weather and difficult terrain, the Germans had already captured part of the territory in the Alps and Oslo, after the Polish army occupied parts of Zlin. The Soviet Union will announce a non-aggression pact with Poland on October 5th. The next day, the Red Army begins its invasion of southeastern Poland with the aim of establishing a common border with Czechoslovakia. As for Czechoslovakia, since the Polish army has halted and is not advancing on the city of Ostrava, the Czechoslovak High Command decides to focus on fighting the Germans, who, after bombing the Austrian city of Linz, are attempting to cut the railway connection between the 12th and 14th German divisions while simultaneously attacking South Moravia. This attack will become one of the greatest disasters for the Germans, as Czechoslovak engineers devised a plan to destroy the dam to flood the entire territory between northern Austria and southern Moravia, luring the 14th German Army south of Bernau. The entire 14th Army of Germany was destroyed by artillery fire from the mountainous highlands. The German chancellor was shot, and the Qatar conspiracy was already in action, impossible to stop. This took place against the backdrop of many in Germany distrusting the Führer and his plans. The advance of the German troops was slow, but now the Soviet Union had intervened in the conflict. Formally, Germany and the Soviet Union were not at war, but in practice, the Red Army was striving to reach Czechoslovakia as quickly as possible to protect the front against Germany. This is why the southeast of Poland came under the control of the Red Army, as this region was vital for the success of the plan. It is important to note that Poland and Germany were not allies, and Germany was also not at war with the Soviet Union. But this is how the front lines would look due to the AAR conspiracy. I assume that Germany will exit the war, as prominent members of the ultra-nationalist party will be arrested and their equipment sabotaged. After the peace agreement between Czechoslovakia and Germany, France, along with the United Kingdom, will call on the Soviet Union to immediately cease its invasion of Poland. Stalin finally agrees to end the invasion, but only on the condition that he retains the captured parts of Poland. This can be justified by the fact that the Soviet Union will ensure eternal peace, as it will be able to help Czechoslovakia. The Allies will agree that Stanislav and Volhynia will become part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, that is, the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakia, in turn, will receive back the occupied part from Poland. Overall, the development of the situation will be almost identical to if Czechoslovakia had defended itself without the intervention of the Soviet Union, which is a scenario I have already considered. The only difference lies in the humiliating position of Poland. Now I want to show you a coin from Czechoslovakia from the 20s, issued in 1921, right after the country was created. Despite Czechoslovakia being formed in 1919, it took 2 years to create a national currency. Previously, francs were likely used. I like that the back of this coin features a symbol that can be considered communist. This coin worth 20 hellers, and I also have 25 hellers, but from the year 1933, which is close to the discussed time. These coins were likely used during the crisis in the Sudetenland, and shortly after Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. Now let's return to the video. I want to quickly mention that I was a bit optimistic. The Red Army was still undergoing a massive purge, and their offensive capabilities were severely limited. Nevertheless, I believe they will be able to reach Czechoslovakia, even at the cost of hundreds of thousands of communist lives. In the following years, the Kingdom of Hungary, fearing the Russians, Bolshevism begins to build its relationships with a little entente. Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy will be ousted, and his place will be taken by Pál, who was also a Hungarian nationalist, but, on the other hand, opposed German hegemony and actually sympathized with the Czechoslovakians. A territorial compromise is likely to occur, where the kingdom will return Hungarian regions of Slovakia and Transcarpathia, as well as western parts of Transylvania and northern Wine. Joking aside, Benito Mussolini, fearing communism, also prefers to start cooperation with allies. Nationalist Spain, which is no longer receiving support from Germany, and from where the German Legion Corps is leaving, begins to feel quite isolated. Soon receiving significant material support from the Soviet Union and Czechoslovak volunteers, Republican Spain stabilizes, preventing Francisco Franco from ever capturing Madrid. However, this leads to 2 warring Spanish factions reaching a stalemate, where neither can gain sufficient superiority over the entire country. In the end, a temporary truce will likely be reached, and the map of the Iberian Peninsula will look almost the same as in the game Hearts of Iron IV in July 1936. The only difference will be that the entire northern coast of Spain will remain under the control of General Franco, while the Balearic Islands will pass to the Republic. As for the future of Europe, it is hard to say, as the Moscow Treaty was never signed and likely never will be. There will be no occupation of Bessarabia, the Baltic states, or invasion of Finland, at least not in the beginning. As a result, the Soviet Union will have to focus on Spain. Stalin will likely try to make Republican Spain his puppet. If World War II ever started, the Soviet Union would certainly be its initiator, which would likely happen if Franco's Spain started collaborating with the Allies, as Italy did, out of fear of communism. This would be a realistic scenario, as little could happen without an ultra-nationalist Germany. No one is insane enough to start a world war. Nevertheless, the world turns out to be significantly changed. But let's consider a much more interesting scenario, albeit with some loss of realism. Let's return to the conspiracy theory. What if the Soviet Union did not sign a peace treaty with Poland and decided to continue conquering the weakened Poland? Before I answer, you need to understand that in 1936, the Allies had the opportunity to defeat a Germany that was not yet so powerful. However, although they felt animosity towards the Soviet Union, the peoples of France and Britain were not ready to go to war with a distant country, especially in France, where a third of the population viewed the Soviet Union as a paradise for peasants and workers. A civil war could have begun if it had declared war on the Soviet Union. The Soviets were aware of this, and that's why they could risk further advancement into Poland, not expecting resistance from the Allies. A stable economy and high standard of living in the United Kingdom did not threaten a civil war like that which occurred in France. However, at that time, even Britain was not seeking conflict with a power on the other side of the world. Ironically, the only hope for the Polish people could be the defeated Germans, who, by intervening in Poland's affairs, could save Europe from Bolshevism, as the Allies wished. As for the Soviet Union, mass purges were still happening, and the Red Army, although successful at that time, could be pushed back into Ukraine after the Germans became involved in this conflict. It should not be forgotten that the Poles also had one of the largest armies in Europe. However, if the war dragged on until winter, it would mean a complete collapse of the German economy, as without gold, it would be impossible to finance either factories or citizens in Germany. Germany would likely become a temporary military hunter, with a promise to restore democracy after the war, so the military would hardly be able to effectively manage the country's economy. Therefore, a prolonged war would significantly benefit the Soviet Union. Now let's consider the most optimistic and realistic scenario in which the Germans and Poles could have expelled the Soviets. Stalin had two options, either to push the Polish army out of western Belarus, which at that time belonged to Poland, or to try to capture the city of Lviv, which the Red Army could not take during the October War. Stalin decides to capture this city, populated by Poles, and deliver a symbolic defeat to the Crusaders against Bolshevism. However, this will give the Polish-German coalition the opportunity to attack the Red Army from both the north and the west, effectively surrounding it. By the end of October 1938, the Soviet Union loses over 100,000 people and more than 1,000 tanks. Ultimately, Stalin decides to sign a peace treaty, effectively repeating the same situation as in our history during the Winter War with Finland. However, this time they do not annex even a scrap of hostile territory. Europe is safe for now. Now let's consider a more absurd scenario. What if Stalin decided to displace the Poles from western Belarus instead of capturing the city of Lviv? In this case, one could allow the Poles and Germans to exhaust their forces until a civil war erupted in the Reich. I have already mentioned how unstable Germany would be in such a scenario. In this case, the front line would remain stable, as the Red Army would have gone on the defensive in hostile territory, making the Polish-German counterattack unsuccessful. In December, unrest would follow in Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Brandenburg, after which a coalition of anarchists, communists, and social democrats, very similar to that in the Spanish Republic, would come to power. At this moment, Germany, or at least 3 of its provinces, are trying to calm the revolution, relying on police and military. However, continuing the struggle in Poland will be a fatal mistake. The left socialist coalition of Germany takes control over northern Germany, except for East Prussia. Austria, receiving support from Benito Mussolini, declares independence from Germany. Following her, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and finally the Rhine proclaim independence, which will soon become a French protectorate. By the end of December, all of Poland, including Warsaw, is under the control of the Red Army. In January of the following year, the new state borders are defined as follows. The province of Suwałki is ceded to Lithuania. Western Belarus is annexed by the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Western Ukraine by the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The new Polish People's Republic is forced to surrender Gdansk and the Danzig corridor to the new German Democratic Republic. Meanwhile, Via recognizes the independence of Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, and of course, Austria. The Allies will respond to all this with sanctions that have already been lifted from Italy. Even Czechoslovakia, which Tan entered the war against Poland with, begins to see the Soviet Union more as a threat than as a friend. In the neighboring kingdom of Hungary, a change of leadership will occur, and it will join the Little Tigers, along with Austria and possibly the southern German states. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Italy begins to reconcile with its allies to defeat the Spanish communists, even if it requires establishing a Francoist dictatorship on the Iberian Peninsula. In such conditions, communists can only be defeated if democratic countries begin to cooperate with nationalists. Even the cruel imperialist Japan, which now has no ability to occupy France and China, will not be subject to sanctions, preventing an attack on Pearl Harbor. However, if Stalin wins, he will have to temper his expansionist ambitions and focus on improving the standard of living in subjugated Poland and Allied Germany. Of course, I doubt that this will be possible among Catholic Poles, especially when the Russians regain control of their homeland. On the other hand, if submission surpasses resistance, it could help the Bolsheviks strengthen their positions in Central Europe. Another important step will be to support the Spanish Republic in the fight against nationalists in order to further radicalize the French population.